Okay, hello everybody. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar. We have a very large number of people planning to attend with nearly 1,200 people registered. So we're going to give it another at least a minute or two to allow for more people to join. I see we're up to almost 500 already, which is terrific. We'll give a couple minutes to allow for more people to join and then we'll get started. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We have a large number of people planning to attend, so we're going to wait about another minute, give a few more people a chance to jump on, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I see a couple people putting in the chat box that it took them a little while to be able to get onto the line, which is exactly why we're waiting before we get started. We have a large number of people participating, so about 30 more seconds and we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, Clarence, I think we're ready to go whenever you're ready to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. And hello, everybody. I'm Clarence Anthony. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the National League of Cities. I love the fact that everybody's so proud of where they're from and talking about Atlanta's in the house, New Jersey's in the house. Well, I got to tell you, we got Oakland, California, we got San Antonio in the house as well. And I'm in Washington, D.C. along with Diane and others. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining today with the National League of Cities and the National Low Income Housing Coalition on this important call. It really is to learn about how to ensure an equitable distribution of emergency rental assistance in your community. With the release of the updated emergency rental assistance guidance from Treasury, the National Low Income Housing Coalition and NLC really saw an opportunity to provide joint recommendations to local elected officials and their staff to minimize obstacles, in fact, because we got to maximize the use of the rental aid and ensure that the critical federal resources reach households with the greatest need. You know, I happen to be a former mayor, and I find that learning from others and listening to others about recommendations was valuable during my time. I know local elected officials from around the 19,000 cities, towns, and villages in the nation will find these recommendations very helpful as well. Based on the work conducted by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the Furman Center, and the Housing Initiative at Penn, these recommendations provide concrete steps for local governments and their partners to equitably distribute rental assistance using a racial equity lens. Using a racial equity lens to distribute funding to households and measure the impact of this distribution is essential. We have to tell the story. We have to measure. We've heard this before, and many of us in this room know that this pandemic has shown disproportionately that it's affected Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities more so than ever. What this last year made obvious is that the eviction crisis was not born out of this pandemic. Rather, the pandemic exacerbated existing racial inequities in housing and evictions. You know, we have to be data driven. And this type of information is key to keep our work helping local leaders understand what is the foundation of these inequities that we have seen and why the following trends still stand. Black, Indigenous, and Latino Hispanic households are more likely than white households to be extremely low-income renters. Low-income women of color face higher rates of evictions. BIPOC are overrepresented among the homeless populations in America, with significantly higher rates for Black Americans. More importantly, it shows why embedding and operationalizing racial equity in housing programs ensures that our most vulnerable residents are protected and included in the solutions that we need to develop. So it's imperative that local governments, local leaders, and their partners must incorporate racial equity performance measurements that will hold government accountable and guarantee access to emergency rental assistance by all of these in need. I cannot stress this enough. So these recommendations are critical, and we're going in the right direction. It's a first step in the right direction and a blueprint for how government should deliver essential housing resources long after the pandemic is over. So I'm excited today to learn more, but we also have two outstanding local leaders that's going to help us learn about how they are implementing programs within their communities and how you can as well. So to kick off today's event or call, I would like to introduce Mayor Libby Schaff, Mayor of Oakland, California, and co-chairs of Mayors and CEOs for U.S. Housing Investment, and Councilwoman Rebecca Veragran, Council Member of San Antonio, Texas. Good afternoon, guys. How are y'all?
Hi, good afternoon. Glad to be here.
We say in Oakland, I'm hella good.
All right. Well, good to see you guys. And I am excited because I know both of you and I have watched your work. And, you know, Mayor, you and I have worked on mayors and CEOs. Rebecca is Councilmember Veragran has been on our board, on my executive committee. And I guess, first of all, just tell you, I admire both of you and what you're doing. So thank you for being here. So
we admire you, Clarence, and your leadership. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, guys. So let me just start by talking about what you're doing in regards to rental relief programs in your community, in terms of what best practices have you found, and what do you think we can do to share more of this information? Mayor, why don't I start with you, and then Council Member, why don't you take up on that opening question?
Well, thank you, Clarence. And it is awesome to see all of America represented on this call and the passion that people have for meeting this moment and keeping our most vulnerable renters with that basic human dignity of a roof over their heads. So thank you for your care. In Oakland, I want to say one thing we did before this moment that I think really helped us be prepared, that I think other cities should look to do. We took the issue of homelessness prevention. How do we keep our most vulnerable who are housed but are at risk of losing that housing securely housed? We took that challenge to our philanthropic community and stood up something several years ago called Keep Oakland Housed, using entirely private funding so that we could experiment, so we could fail, so we could change it quickly. And so after 2 years of kind of perfecting a homelessness prevention intervention using private money, we were really ready for this moment when public money became available to keep our most vulnerable renters housed. So think about partnering with philanthropy to experiment so that you can with confidence tell the public that you've tested these concepts, that you know they work, in order to actually get their trust to make the significant public investments that are required. But as far as running our rental assistance program with the federal funding, there are definitely some things that we believe have made our program very, very effective and reaching people who need it the most. And first and foremost, that is using trusted community-based organizations. We have many communities that are distrustful of the government and who are not connected with the normal communications channels to even find out about help that is available right now. And so for us to reach those who are most vulnerable, for us to reach the racial groups that have been systemically excluded and disadvantaged by our existing systems, we've got to be in the community with people who are trusted. And in Oakland, it's not just contracting with nonprofits that have built up that community trust. It has also meant forming what we would call hubs. And that's recognizing that some nonprofit organizations have more capacity to enter into contracts, to meet all the contracting requirements that government asks of nonprofits. But we then require them to pass some of that funding along to the really small, super grassroots organizations that are in some of the most vulnerable communities. And so to be intentional about requiring not just the big nonprofits to be engaged in that outreach and service delivery works, but the smaller ones. One of the things I discovered during this pandemic is that Oakland has a tremendous Mayan Mum speaking population. They do not speak Spanish. They're from Central America. They really needed people who they trusted, who spoke their language. Many of them are undocumented. And so that was another barrier that absolutely the government could not cross. We needed those community partners. I'll go through the other issues more quickly because I think these are better known. One, using self-attestation. We are allowed to do that with this funding. It takes down a huge barrier and it moves the help out quickly. And that is to allow tenants to self-attest to their need for the rental assistance, to what their income is, and the COVID-related cause of their need. To allow the tenants to just self-attest is a huge trust builder with the community and also efficiency. And then finally, to really be intentional about racial equity. And that even means tracking who you are serving to constantly monitor whether you are getting into the most impacted communities. And I don't mean a racially representative sampling of your city. I mean the people who your demographic data shows have been subject to the biggest levels of housing insecurity, income disparity, wealth disparity. In Oakland, that is definitely our BIPOC communities, particularly our Black and Latino communities. So we track our rental assistance to ensure that we are serving those communities, not just at the proportion they are in our community, but at the proportion they are in our kind of economic instability data. And so the last thing I'll say is in Oakland, we had a huge response. We opened our program with the federal funding on April 2nd, and we've already received more than 2,000 applications. It was pretty overwhelming. Because of the need, we actually are limiting our program to people at below 30% of AMI. So we've decided to focus on the most financially vulnerable to best serve where we see just tremendous need. So those are some of the things that we've learned as far as making our program right now very responsive, very efficient, and with a racial equity lens.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor. And as we go to Councilwoman Veragran, I will tell you that we have city leaders and staff from all over America. Put in the chat box so we'll know what city you're from and what state. So maybe our panelists will be able to respond specifically to any questions. Councilwoman, how are you?
Hello, good afternoon, Clarence. Good morning, Mayor. My name is Rebecca Veragran. I'm very honored to be here and honored to see so many local leaders here because as we all know, as part of the NLC family, the work gets done at the local level. We do not have the luxury to pause. And if one thing this pandemic has taught all of us is adaptability and pivoting. And that's extremely important. So I want to also thank NLC and all of the work that you've done advocating for all of our local city, towns, and villages this entire time. And we're seeing the fruits of that, of the work that we've done together. Now, 1 year ago, on April 23rd, the city of San Antonio launched our Emergency Housing Assistance Program. It was a combination of local and CARES Act funding because we knew, like the mayor mentioned, and all of you know, that keeping families housed is the most critical thing for economic and health impacts of our cities. So we knew we had to do something. We started with our local dollars because we, as was mentioned earlier, we already saw eviction rates in the city of San Antonio going up prior to the pandemic. We already had an issue with homelessness and the unhoused prior to the pandemic, but it was exacerbated. And as of May 11th, 2021, our program has helped 35,227 families, representing over 94,000 individuals in our community. That represents $97.44 million in assistance, with over 80 million going to rent or mortgage. And then the rest has been going to utility and internet assistance. One of the things that we see in the city of San Antonio is a digital divide that occurs, mainly in a lot of families in our socioeconomic burden communities that not just do not have access to devices, but do not have access to internet that is at a speed that our students and people could work or learn from. So this is what we had to invest in, and that was over a year ago. We modified, but as you all can imagine, our program had to evolve to meet the needs in our community better. And much like Mayor Schaff said, we had to use local, grassroots, trusted community agents to go into the community to talk to those members, our residents who were trying to get, apply for these dollars, get the information out there, apply for the dollars, because it was only online when we first started out. And then it was clear that we needed to adapt, we needed to evolve and make sure that our applications were accessible to all San Antonians and members of Bexar County, residents of Bexar County, because we also partnered with our county. So not only did they gave us great insights. Our promodoras went out there into the neighborhoods, talked to the community, let us know, as we all know, let us know what was working, what they were mad at, what they didn't like, and we made the changes because we had to get the dollars to the community that most needed them. So we were very strategic in that, and we have our Fair Housing Department, we have our Department of Human Services that really worked to streamline the process, to bring the turnaround process from where they apply and then get payment for their rent. We cut it down. And what we also learned was individuals needed direct financial cash assistance, because those federal dollars also weren't covering for, say, baby formula or other items such as that. So we also included some cash assistance. But like in Oakland, we partnered with our philanthropic and private community to really help give dollars for direct cash assistance for families that were in need. Now, we started by offering 3 months of assistance with a small cash assistance grant, but as everything continued to grow, we now offer up to 9 months of assistance for those with lower level incomes making below 50% AMI, and the most need, and 6 months for those between 50 and 80% AMI. This is about providing the most help to those in the most need, because we need to make sure people are housed for as long as possible. Another thing that we had to do, because in the state of Texas, things are a little bit different, we had to launch an eviction intervention team. And at the eviction courts, we helped members who were there facing eviction. Our local courts, once they started hearing those evictions again, we had our teams out there at the eviction courts ready to offer that assistance. We worked with the courts. We were there to help with an eviction diversion fund, to help benefit, to help not get evicted from their location. We're continuing to work on that. We have great partners with our Texas Rio Grande Valley partnerships. We have also partnered and contracted with local organizations, from the Apartment Organization Association to grassroots immigration advocates to local housing advocates, to do an outreach and application process and intake to fill out those applications, because we know it is essential. But one of those things that was critical was to have those eviction teams, because we need to make sure that our residents know that both the city and the county have funds available for our residents so they can stay in their homes. So that is some of the work that we've been doing.
Well, I mean, both cities are doing amazing things. And one of the things I want to kind of couple is your response about how do you make sure through design and implementation that we address the racial equity piece of this rental assistance? Because we all talk about data. We all talk about, we know where the gaps are. And so, Mayor, you know, Councilwoman Veragran talked about how they got the application process focused on that community. But the racial equity piece on both of those, what are you doing specifically?
If your city is not already working with GARE, which is the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, I cannot recommend enough that organization as an amazing support in teaching cities how to advance racial equity in everything that we do. And Clarence, you're absolutely right. It's not just looking at the data and seeing where those disparities are. It's about sitting down and interviewing people, listening to their stories about why they are where they are, and listening for the similarities that show you what the racial components are of the disparity. And so, for example, this is going to go in the category of something that this particular program is not necessarily designed to do. One of the things that we heard over and over again were the impacts of racial disparity in getting jobs, in finding housing, in staying in a particular apartment or rental situation. And so it really showed us that one time, you know, a lot of rental assistance programs allow a tenant to only access them one time in their life. But racial discrimination is not a one-time emergency. It is a consistent life condition. And so we certainly have adjusted all our programs to not limit them to once in a lifetime usage, recognizing that came out of our racial equity analysis. So the racial equity analysis requires that deeper digging behind the statistics, GARE, is a great, it's based here at our University of California at UC Berkeley, go Bears. It is a great resource for cities. So that is one example of the racial equity. We already talked about the importance of using community, trusted community messengers, individuals, leaders, organizations, because government is distrusted. We created the system that has caused these inequities. We have to own that and work like hell to change it. Thank you.
Councilwoman?
For the city of San Antonio, we have been utilizing our equity index for years now, and we know the areas in which we need to fight with racial equity as well as, and we also have a refugee population in the community that we also had to identify and work with. This San Antonio is over 63% Latino, and our economic and health disparities are quite clear. We have, from the northern part of the city to the southern part of the city, there is a gap when it comes to education rates, but there's also a health disparities gap where those north of a certain line have a 20 years less of a living lifespan than those of another part. So we know the areas in which we needed to target, and we intentionally went to those areas, small businesses that know that their staff needed help. We worked with our small businesses, those that they had to furlough or put off, that we were able to reach out to those communities. But again, it was our promodoras, our community health workers that were able to go out and really be strategic and make sure that we addressed the racial equity index and the communities with the most need. So that is what we worked with. And we also have benefit navigators. So if you call our number 311 in San Antonio, they will connect you to whatever city program and assistance that you need. And of course, in English and in Spanish, in whatever language you need help with.
Well, let me first of all thank both of you for such great information. I've been watching the chat box, and everybody's asking y'all questions about more resources and how can you respond to this. And we'll try to get some information back to the group. This recording will be available later if you wanted to take additional notes. But Mayor Schaff, you're amazing. I look forward to seeing you later on another meeting, and look forward to working hard in terms of making housing available to everyone in America. And Councilwoman Veragran, thank you all so much, and thank you personally for what you're doing. We're just trying to determine historically what is the best basketball team, the Spurs or the Warriors. But I won't start no fight before y'all go. Thank you again.
All right, thank you. The best team is a housed team. So
that's right.
Let's keep our people housed. I'll take. That's the winner every day.
That's a good response. And now, my pleasure to introduce and bring aboard Diane Yentl, President and CEO and the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and my partner in terms of this work. Thank you. Hey, Diane, how are you?
Hi, Clarence. Thanks so much. And let me just add my thanks, Clarence, to you for your leadership of the National League of Cities and your partnership on this really important work. And many thanks to Mayor Schaff and to Councilmember Veragran for your really good, important, exemplary work on creating emergency rental assistance programs that serve the lowest income and the most marginalized people. It's so helpful to have your leadership at the local level and to share it here at the national level so that other program administrators throughout the country can replicate the work that you're doing. It's really heartening to hear about the careful attention that you are paying to ensure that these funds reach the lowest income and the most marginalized people, and to see how much you are embedding the principles that NLIHC and NLC together have put forward as model ERA programs. So congratulations and thank you very much for your really good work and leadership on this. And we are going to now welcome and hear from members of the administration about changes that they have made to the emergency rental assistance programs, new guidance that they have put out in order to ensure that more programs are following the lead of these model programs and really ensuring that these funds are reaching the lowest income and the most marginalized people. So some of you who are on, so I'm Diane Yantel, I'm President and CEO of the National Income Housing Coalition, and I'm really pleased to have you all on the line today. Some of you were also on NLIHC's national call on Monday, where we were joined by Gene Sperling, who is Senior Advisor to President Biden, to discuss this new emergency rental assistance guidance from the White House and the Department of Treasury. And I'm really pleased to welcome him back today, along with Noel Poyo, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Treasury, to discuss the new guidance in more depth. And many of you who joined our call on Monday and who are here today on this webinar know the challenges and the importance of getting emergency rental assistance to the lowest income and most marginalized renters. And you know the work that we at NLIHC have been doing to ensure that we get this right. For over a year, we have been tracking, monitoring, and analyzing over 900 emergency rental assistance programs. And from that work, we have shared lessons learned, best practices, and roadblocks to getting the money to the renters most in need. And that work has, of course, included carefully tracking emergency rental assistance programs that are funded with the first $25 billion allocation funding from Congress. As of today, we're tracking close to 350 ERA programs, including 43 statewide programs. And from this tracking and the research that we've done throughout, we've been able to identify emerging trends in ERA programs that, if they weren't quickly corrected, would present major challenges to getting the money to the renters most in need. And we've talked about these challenges at length on our national weekly calls, on our weekly state and local implementation calls with our partners at NLC. We've heard from all of you important feedback about what's working and what's not. And we're seeing challenges like landlords refusing to participate in the program, and some program administrators refusing to assist tenants directly, even after their landlords refused to participate. We've seen challenges like some program administrators continuing to require burdensome documentation that's difficult or impossible for some renters to produce, or others explicitly excluding subsidized tenants from receiving assistance with rent arrears. So these are some of the roadblocks that we identified, we documented, and back in March, we shared in a letter to Secretaries Fudge and Yellen, to White House Domestic Policy Director Rice, and to Gene Sperling, the White House Coordinator for the American Rescue Plan implementation and Senior Advisor to President Biden. And as I've been sharing throughout the weeks, the White House and the administration have taken these concerns very seriously. I've had multiple lengthy conversations directly with Gene Sperling, who has been incredibly attentive to these issues, who's focused in on all the important details, the documented challenges, the proven best practices, and the solutions that were needed. And Gene and the teams from Secretaries Yellen, Fudge, and the White House, including Deputy Assistant Secretary Poyo, who joins us today, worked incredibly hard over weekends and late into the night to address each of these challenges in ways that honestly went even further in protecting and assisting tenants than I expected that they would. And each improvement, taken individually and certainly when taken together, will make a tremendous difference in ensuring that these historic resources reach the lowest income and the most marginalized people in need. So I am so pleased to welcome back to today's call Gene Sperling. Gene is formerly the head of the National Economic Council under Presidents Clinton and Obama, the first and the only person to ever hold that position under two presidents. And he is now a senior advisor to President Biden, who appointed him to oversee the implementation of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, including, of course, these essential new resources for emergency rental assistance. And we're also welcoming to the call today Noel Pollo, who, as I said, is Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Treasury and oversees the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So Jean and Noel, thank you again for being so focused and responsive to all of the concerns we raised. And thank you for making such significant improvements to the ERA program. And thanks again for being here today. And Jean, I will turn it over to you now. It's good to see you, Jean. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the National League of Cities, who's been an enormous partner, not just on this, but as they know, we have done many briefings on the state and local plan that just came out, and to Diane and the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which has always been my go-to place on a lot of these issues. But the partnership in the last couple months has been just crucial and extraordinary. And, I start with the view that we don't, you can look at a program, all the rules, but, what's the ultimate goal? And the ultimate goal is, the dignity and security that comes from housing security, and the corresponding devastation that comes from eviction, foreclosure, from losing your house, not being able to, be sure you can provide the kind of shelter and housing and security for your family. I mean, these are just among the most important things, any of us can do. And there's a lot of people on this call who are just true heroes who've devoted their life to this. And our goal in representing the values of the president and vice president is to do what we can with the legislation we have to put that into action. Now, a key part of the implementation of the American Rescue Plan is, getting reporting, getting information, using that reporting to encourage people to get the results that we're hoping for, to make sure that help is reaching all Americans, communities of color, that we're thinking about that on the front end and creating that expectation on the front end. That said, when you have something like this situation, you really can't wait for reporting. You can't wait for everything to come in. You have to try to understand what is happening on the ground, affecting real people's lives, and get the best sense of both what is working, what is not working, and respond with speed and force. And to be quite honest, literally the only way we can do that is to rely on the advocates like Diane, the experts like so many of you who are running programs, advocating for programs. It is true that Diane and I had at one point a 3-hour conversation while I was driving in a somewhat hilly area. And not only did we talk for 3 hours, but we fought through at least 10 internet interruptions on our phone interruptions on our conversation. But the reason why is because these are, without this information, we can't be sure that we are serving our intended purposes. So I can't thank you enough for the information you provided, the consultation. It truly did so much to inform us. Noel does an enormous amount of outreach to around the country to do this. But so that's one thing. Secondly, I think Diane hit something well that was part of the goal, which was each and every item that we put in, and we highlighted 9 specific new policies. We believe, based on what we are hearing and seeing, that each one of these is addressing a true obstacle to keeping people in their homes or helping people make a transition. But there's no question, by putting them all together, by putting them out on a single fact sheet, we are hoping to send a bigger message. And one of the things you'll see is that there were some areas where we could only make the improvement with the force we wanted in the ERA2, the part that came from the American Rescue Plan. But we felt that by speaking with a very clear and strong voice, we would be sending a very strong message about what were the what this administration was encouraging and looking for. And it is our hope that this will have a broader impact, even in a few of those areas where the specific requirement that we put in only dealt to the only directly impacted the money that came, so-called ERA2, or the money that came directly from the American Rescue Plan. So yes, in putting them together and doing a clear message, we are hoping to have the actual direct impact, but also to send the kind of larger signal. And again, I really do have to thank the National Low Income Housing Coalition for their views, for bringing together the views of, I think, a lot of people who are probably, you know, listening now, and for those other folks here who we heard directly from. So let me just say a little bit about some of the things we heard and some of the things we tried to move on. One of the things that we heard that was just, to us, not acceptable with the values that this president wants us to be governing on is that in some places, people were, grantees were offering funds to landlords, and if they refused to participate or didn't get back, instead of going to the tenant, they were just closing the book. The idea that we could have a program that designed people in their home, help the most vulnerable renters, and that some of them could face homelessness because their landlord chose not to participate, and there simply was not even an effort then to see if they could go through the tenant, the renters. That was just unacceptable. We found that we did have the authority to require that under ERA2. And so we put that down. We hope that sends a strong message for all of the programs that are out there funded by ERA. Two, that when funds go directly to the landlord, which this coordination no doubt works well in places, and we don't want to discourage it or encourage it where it does, that where the landlord refuses to participate, that the time that the tenant is, that assistance is offered to the tenant is cut in half. So instead of 14 days for mail, it goes to 7, for other contact from 10 days to 5. So one, you're required to, if the landlord says no, and you got to do it quicker. And 3, we made very clear that this legislation also allows grantees to have policies that just initially go to tenants. We think that is the right interpretation of this law, and we wanted to put it front and center in the guidance and in the fact sheet that this was allowable, a new and allowable use. And 4, we want to make sure that these funds, this 46 billion, is not only strong enough, but it's nimble enough. We don't know exactly how things will evolve over the next few months. Our goal is to keep people in their homes. That's our first goal. But if it turns out through either a judge striking down the eviction moratoriums or just leases not being renewed, that there are more people where the path to housing security lies in helping to get new housing, we wanted to make crystal clear that all of this funding can be for that purpose, for helping people get to that a new housing situation, the cost, the security deposit, future rent, utilities. I think it is possible that this could be a more important use of the funds as time goes on, but we wanted to get ahead of that situation and make that crystal clear. The other thing that we heard a bit was of people being denied simply because they were getting assistance to they were already getting federally assisted housing or some form of assistance. That also is not acceptable. You could we could not ban that outright for everyone, but the way that we did ban it on the Emergency Rescue Act 2, the American Rescue Plan, makes clear that we are concerned that that type of ban could have a disparate impact inconsistent with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And so again, we feel like the message that we sent out there will have a more powerful impact. Documentation was obviously an issue we heard a lot from people about. We tried to do what we thought was the best to balance reducing that unnecessary documentation while still maintaining the most basic program integrity aspects that I have to say somebody doing implementation has to take seriously. And so there's just a very strong message about not having unnecessary documentation that serves as barriers to people becoming part of the program, and the ability to use factual proxies, such as if a person is living in just a terribly poor block or area, that should be a reasonable factual proxy of their low income and eligibility. So I think we made perhaps not quite as much progress as some people might have liked, but I think very, very significant. We also made sure that we wanted to document the focus on those most at need, those with incomes below 50% of the area median income, and that it was not acceptable to take our money and to evict somebody even if their lease was running out. So we required that from 30 to 90 days, you at least have to continue. So continue housing the person that you are getting this aid for. So these were 9 things that we put together that I think, I just think, I said this before, this isn't Noel and I think there's just an enormous number of people who are co-authors of this, because none of this came really from official reporting. It came from outreach. It came from us listening to experts, to advocates, to people on the ground, and trying to respond when we had good, strong, factual indications that there were obstacles to the ultimate goals that we want. I got to tell you that, I've been in a lot of administrations. The next person you're going to hear from, Noel, is just one of the most impressive people I've worked with. I mean, you want somebody in the job like this who's got both heart and brains. He has both heart, brains, and experience, all 3. And he's just been a great partner, and really at Treasury takes the leadership role in a lot of the actual architecture of this. And so I don't know if Diane, if you wanted to say more, or I should just turn over, but I wanted to say that before I ended.
Great, thanks so much, Jean. I appreciate those remarks. I would love to hear from Noel, and then we can do some questions and answers with you both if possible.
Great. Appreciate it, Diane. Thank you, Jean. So, I'm just going to underline a few things that you've already heard here. This has been a heck of a lineup, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time giving remarks. I'd love to get to question and answer, because I think that's what a lot of folks want to do. It's been spectacular to hear from Councilwoman Veragran, from San Anto, my hometown, and you have a long-term advocate there. No surprise that she's engaged here in this call. But let me just underline a couple of things. Look, you heard from the mayor and from the councilwoman a set of best practices, and in a system like this where we're trying to set up programs all across the country, in states and localities and for RA1 and tribes, it is so important for folks to be able to look to their right and to their left and see what other folks are doing. And so I think what the National Low Income Housing Coalition and National League of Cities are doing here by highlighting best practices here in the country is terribly important. You heard about, diversion from eviction courts. We're seeing this more and more, really important, right? The idea is to get people, before they're in that eviction process. Targeting vulnerable populations, both in policy and in outreach, using community-based organizations as really important conduits, especially to populations that may be intimidated by or have really good reasons to be worried about local government, state government, or federal government. partnering with apartment owners, right? And making sure that we're all working together on this thing to get the resources to people who need it. So just, I want to underline how important it is, and you're going to hear more out of the Treasury Department together with our colleagues, because as you know, I think one of the tremendous things that has come from Gene Sperling's sort of leaning into this space, he's got kind of a mildly large job overseeing $1.9 trillion, but has really placed focus on programs that impact vulnerable people, that say something about who we are, and as a nation, as an administration, and making this a full government approach. I'm sitting in the Treasury Department. I'm doing my best. We've got great colleagues in other departments, but to have the White House call everyone together and say, this is who we are, right? This is why we're here. Is just, it's inspiring. It's tremendously catalyzing. And so you will see from Treasury, from HUD, from USDA, from the White House itself, our ongoing sort of leaning into what you heard announced on Friday and what Gene laid out for you today. And then the other thing is just to underline some of what Gene was talking about in the policymaking, that we are trying to send a clear message here. This isn't a bunch of small messages. I hope each one of these policies is impactful in its own right. And indeed, I was on calls this morning with grantees who were looking at adopting within, it was announced on Friday, already looking at adopting place-based proxies, right? Because they think that that's going to both make their administration of income documentation more streamlined, faster, and actually cheaper for them, right? As a local entity, and absolutely as accurate, right? That they're frankly not terribly worried about this being some sort of compliance problem. It's just a way to get there better, faster, smarter, right? And so we really hope that each of these individual policies do have their impact. But overall, I hope that the nation, that grantees, that advocates will hear that we are doing everything that we can and want to work in partnership with everybody that we can to get these resources to, in this moment. Like this is the moment, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. We are at a point where the arrearages are really significant, and we can make this difference for millions of people, right? And so I know that everybody working around the country on this is motivated and is doing our best, but we hope that you hear that lean in, that we understand where the nation is right now and how to deliver this. And the final thing I'll say is just, advocacy matters, right? It matters that you all on this call speak up, speak to this administration as you've been doing, speak to the grantees that have to adopt some of these policies, to communicate with vulnerable people in your communities, to help people get over that very reasonable fear, I think in some cases, of like, do I do this? It's a different day in terms of government working for people, and I hope you will encourage people. And landlords need to be a part of this, need to be a part of who's in the big tent, and all of us, sort of with our oars pulling in the same direction. So I will stop there and just thank once again the National Income Housing Coalition and NLC for everything you're doing here, because it matters.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Noel, and thanks again, Gene. Thank you both for your attention, your careful attention, and your incredible work on the improvements to the program. We do have dozens and dozens of questions that came in advance, and many dozens more that are coming in now. I'm going to ask the first one to Gene, because I know we only have you for a couple more minutes, and then Noel, I'll have plenty more for you after that. So Gene, the first question, and we've had many people ask it, relates to how the guidance applies to the first allocation of 25 billion and the second allocation of 21 billion. And the question is really around, especially from advocates and low-income tenants on the line, how can they use the new guidance the Treasury has put out to encourage program administrators to apply it to all of the funds, and especially as it relates to the assistance going directly to tenants when landlords have refused?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a great discussion that I'd like to hear more. I think that what you should feel free is, of course, to say that what is in here, as I think Noelle said, goes not just to the technical side of what we were technically able to require, but to what we believe are the preferred policies. So yes, we can absolutely require that if you're using that second amount of money, that you have to, if the landlord refuses, offer that to the tenant directly. If somebody were to say, well, does that apply as much to ERA 1? Well, we've made very clear, as you do in guidance. Guidance doesn't always say, this is 100% requirement. It strongly encourages, it tells people what the administration's policy is, how money should be used. I think it's been pretty clear in here that it is the policy of this administration not to close the books if a landlord refuses. I think if somebody were to say, well, this only directly banned exclusions of people who were in federally assisted housing for the ERA 2 money, I think it's pretty clear you can say, well, they banned that, they used that higher authority they had in the American Rescue Plan to do that based on a concern that this type of decision would have a disparate impact, perhaps a disparate racial impact inconsistent with Title VI. So I think it's very clear to say, not only the administration strongly encourage it, they are letting people know that if they're doing this, we are concerned, and you ought to be concerned as to whether you are living within our civil rights laws. So again, I feel that in a few of these areas where the more direct ban exclusion was direct, could only be put in the guidance for the ERA 2 part, I think people can feel very comfortably saying that that is the stated policy of this administration. That is how, this is what we believe, and that they should, feel feel empowered to relay that message. And if hearing it from Noelle and I makes you feel a little more empowered, then it was worth doing. That alone makes it worth doing this call.
Well, that's enormously helpful, Jean. Thank you very much for saying it so clearly. And I know that you have to go now for another commitment. So I just want to say again, thank you so much for your work on this. Thank you for being such a champion for low-income people and low-income renters. And thanks for spending time with us on today's call.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody on this call. And again, so many people just on this call are just, total heroes devoting their life to me, I think about as important as anything you can do. I'll just say I wrote a book about thinking about economics in terms of economic dignity. And I think that there's few things that have that actual economic impact, but that, impact on your ability to feel that you're providing, caring for your loved ones like this. So this is, as Noelle said, this is the law, this is what's in our head, but this is in our hearts too. And we hope we will be living up to what people are fighting for. And just last thing I'll say is, this isn't about doing this and moving on to the next topic. This is a challenge. We know all the challenges out there. So we got to stay at it. So please let us know what else you think would be helpful, both kind of guidance wise, but also bully pulpit wise, encouragement, little elbow, little thumb on the scale, anything that you think helps achieve the ultimate goals of this, we want to hear. So thank you.
Thank you, Jean. I will turn now to Noelle to ask some of the many, many questions that are being asked now. And I'll say to everybody who's participating and listening in, thank you for sending so many questions in advance. And during today's call, we'll do our best to get to some of them. We certainly won't get to all of them, but we are working on continuously updating our FAQs, and we'll reach out to Noelle and others on his team to get all your questions answered as soon as we can. So Noelle, I want to start with some questions around the use of the funds and questions about the length of time that people can use to pay rent arrears, and whether there's any flexibility for ERA funds used to pay back rent to a prior landlord. And the example there is for people who owed rent arrears, they left that apartment to move in with a friend or family members, they still carry that debt. Can rent arrears be used to assist them? I mean, can ERA be used to assist them?
The simple answer here is yes. That is to say, it's always useful to go back to just sort of the basics of what this money can be used for, the qualified expenses, what qualifies a household. And if it's a qualifying household, the income qualified, et cetera, and there was an obligation to pay rent, whether or not they still live there, resolving that arrearage can be enormously impactful, including impactful in their ability to access housing in the future, right? And so there's a tie there. And so there's no question that to the extent that the tenant is qualified and they're able to show that qualification, which does require, if it's a landlord applying, it does require some collaboration there with a tenant. Sometimes that's challenging, but there's no question that it is an eligible, that the ERA dollars can be used to resolve arrearages, including when the household is no longer living in the unit.
Okay, thank you. And what can you say about whether and how program administrators can assist undocumented immigrants?
So neither the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, which is the December law that produced ERA 1, nor the American Rescue Plan, the law that produced ERA 2, speak in the emergency rental assistance sections to the question of documentation, people's immigration status. And so there are a clear set of requirements for being qualified for this money. There's been a lot of discussion about what documentation is necessary for those qualifications, all laid out, I think, very clearly in the Treasury FAQs. And so there is nothing in there about immigration status.
Very good, thank you. There's also, there's a number of questions around the new guidance that landlords cannot evict while ERA is being received. So if you could say some more about that guidance and what it means and how it's applied, and also how it interacts with if landlords refuse to participate and tenants receive those funds directly, whether that applies.
I'm really glad you asked about this, because this is a really weedsy and difficult but very important area. So a few things. First, there is the question of, and you read in our FAQs, what Treasury is saying to grantees, you must do and you're encouraged to, right? There is a separate thing about what the grantee can then say to a landlord. And it's important to remember that the mechanism by which the grantee sort of gets the landlord to agree to these conditions is that agreement through which the dollars flow. So there's an agreement between the city or the state or the tribe in ERA 1 and the landlord, in which they accept those dollars and any conditions that are added there. So first, if a landlord receives dollars that pays forward prospective rent for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, whatever it might be, they cannot evict during that period. That is to say that the federal government has paid for a period of time, and you may not throw somebody out during that period of time if you've received payment for it. Second, we have seen numerous grantees putting in place a further requirement of landlords that gets enshrined in that agreement between the grantee and the landlord. And it's going beyond the period that is covered, sometimes 30 days, sometimes more. In some cases, it's really quite long and seems to have been actually scared a lot of landlords out of the program. But in looking at that information, it seems like it is a good idea and a very reasonable protection to provide to tenants if a grantee requires landlords to, beyond that period that the person is covered, maybe they received 60 days worth of assistance, that for 30 to 90 days after that, the landlord should also be agreeing not to evict. Now, that is not a requirement that Treasury is putting on grantees, but it is something grantees may require of landlords. And then the final thing is I've emphasized that this agreement between the grantee and the landlord is the mechanism. So if the dollars flow to the tenant directly, there is no agreement, there is no sort of legal structure to bind the landlord with. And so those protections don't follow necessarily the dollars if they flow to the tenant. I know this has been a little weedsy and a little detailed, but I think it's important for us to talk through. So if I mess that up or need to clarify, please let me know.
No, it's very helpful, Noel. There's another set of questions on documentation that's required. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And there's interest in understanding better, what does avoid establishing burdensome documentation requirements mean? And a lot of interest in the possibility of using proxies or other available information to determine eligibility. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, give some examples, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me begin by saying, we've thought really hard from the beginning of this program until what we released last Friday about this balance between access and preventing fraud, right? And so we've leaned into a variety of ways of providing access. And I don't want there to be any sort of lack of clarity that we believe that all of these ways of leaning into opening access are absolutely consistent with maintaining program integrity and preventing fraud. If we believed that these things couldn't be implemented in a way that prevents fraud, we would not put them out there. Because a dollar stolen from low-income people by fraudsters is just as bad as a dollar kept from someone because they couldn't get access to it, right? So I know that this whole discussion has oftentimes had this shadow of like, well, what about fraud? Fraud is a huge problem. We need to be absolutely vigilant about it. And we are very confident that all of these opportunities for streamlining documentation can be implemented in a reasonable way with a reasonable anti-fraud program. These are not in contradiction, right? So I've jumped up and down about that. So I think one of the things that's really important is to look at sort of how particular documentation requirements are actually playing out, right? We did our level best back in February to set out one set of requirements about documentation and timelines. And you saw on last Friday that we were willing to go back and say, okay, we've gone out and we've looked at the market, right? We've listened to what people have said, and you know what? We need to update some of this stuff, right? So I think one of the things we really want to do is when we say, well, what's unreasonably preventing access? Well, let's look at who's getting access, right? And so that's one way I think of thinking about it. Using those proxies, I think is a very reasonable way of reducing administrative burden and making a system run faster. It is terribly important that we get these resources as fast and as reasonably as we can to folks. And so being able to, unless you've got, millionaires in your city that are camped out in, very, very low income places, it seems like it's a reasonable thing to look at areas that have very high levels of low income people and say, look, this can be a reasonable proxy for people who are coming in and applying. This is not a new idea. So we're not sort of making this stuff up. This has been implemented in government in many contexts in various places over the course of a long time, right? And so we have seen that these kinds of proxies can be used in responsible ways, in ways that absolutely reduce burden and keep an accurate adherence to the law and the regulation. So in any case, those are a few things to think about in this space. But we've really tried to make sure that we're giving, I guess, enough comfort and clarity to local governments and state governments that I really understand are wringing their hands about this stuff a bit, right? Like, are you going to come and slap us on the back end about well, you don't have all your documentation in place? That's a reasonable thing for a government to ask, right? Especially given experiences recently, as recently as last year with the implementation of other programs. And so we want folks to understand, we think this can be used in a reasonable way. We want these to be, to the extent that local program administrators think this can be used, please use it, right? Save yourself the money and give people the time, to give them the time back, right? So that they're not waiting so long.
Great, thanks, Noel. And I know we only have a few more minutes with you, so I'm doing my best to sort of group together many questions into one or two. And we do have a lot of questions about other uses of the funds for housing stability, specifically around one, housing people who are currently experiencing homelessness with ERA funds, and two, about relocation, helping renters who get evicted or need a new unit to be safe, how these ERA funds can be used for relocation costs.
Yeah, so Jean underlined this issue on relocation, and I think it also applies to the situation of folks being homeless or experiencing homelessness. These dollars can be a pathway to people getting housed, regardless of whether they've experienced an eviction, right? Regardless of whether they've been living outside, whether they feel like they're going to have to move because they're under pressure where they are, whatever it is, right? That the idea here is that people need to have a rental obligation, so there needs to be a place that they're moving to. So there may be some administrative work to do there to sort of get something lined up, right? But then the cost associated with that move, with getting people into a stable housing situation, we've enumerated some. It's certainly not an exhaustive list. Grantees should, in their policies and procedures, document what they think is reasonable and follow those policies and procedures consistently all the time for everybody, right? But we know, for as much as all of us are going to lean in and try and prevent as many evictions as possible and ensure people stay in the homes that they're currently in, there are going to be people that are going to have to move to a new housing situation. Let's support them in doing that. It's eligible. It's clear, right? We're jumping up and down and couldn't be any more clear about this, right? And their status, whether they meet a federal homelessness guideline or what have you, that's sort of neither here nor there. That is to say, is this an eligible household under the ERA? Do they have a rental obligation? Let's focus on the sort of regulatory space that we have here as opposed to other regulatory spaces, which might be more difficult to prove or require more documentation or what have you. So I hope that's helpful.
It's so helpful, Noel. It's very helpful. It is clear in the guidance. It's even more clear when you say it officially from the Department of Treasury. So it's very, very helpful. Relatedly, can you say, somebody is asking about whether you have any guidance on guaranteeing more than 3 months of future rent when relocating households in order to attract more landlords to the program.
Yeah, so you'll see that's one area where there's some administrative difference between ERA 1 and ERA 2. Obviously, when you have a program that is already in place and you have to sort of work the rules around, we did what we could with ERA 1, but I think local policy should learn from what the market is telling it. This is a place where landlords can be, I think, really helpful and informative about, what do we think is going to be the most important sort of policy place to be in terms of how much to put out to put out front in these kinds of situations. And so there may be sort of reasonable different places that different states or localities might land in answering this question. But I think that there is a difference here that structure is not an ERA 2 versus ERA 1.
Okay, thanks. And then I'm going to ask two last burning questions that several people have asked. One is around how is Treasury defining obligation for purposes of the September 30th obligation requirement, and how is Treasury tracking spending, and how and when will that be publicly available?
Yeah, so the definition of obligation, definitely not something you want to shoot from the hip on a webinar. This is, I will say that there has been a few words that have gotten more discussion internally than this word obligation, because it's used in the statute, but it also has a meaning in GAAP and a variety of other places, and that's a little complicated. So I hope everyone will forgive me for not giving a full answer to this question. We know that it is very important that we get our guidance out on reallocations as soon as we possibly can, right? And so we are working on that. I don't have a date to announce to you, but folks need to know well in advance of that first September 30 for ERA 1 and obviously next spring for ERA 2. But we're working on it. And the second one, Diane, I'm sorry.
Is how are you tracking spending at the grantee level, and when and how will you make that publicly available?
Yeah, so we've frankly been tracking it quite closely, but before we get all the reporting in from the first quarterly report, obviously we're pulling data from lots and lots of different places. It's a little bit difficult to aggregate, and certainly not something that we can put out publicly. We do have reporting coming in for the first quarter, and soon thereafter some small updates on a monthly basis. And so you can expect later this month that we will be putting out data on what's happening through a consistent required reporting nationwide. I've been dying to get this data for a long time. So you'll see this stuff out later this month.
Okay, great. Great. Well, thanks so much, Noel. You've been so generous with your time. And again, so appreciate your leadership and your partnership and your commitment to getting this right. Really appreciate you. Thank you, Noel.
Look, I'm here to serve, and you guys are showing leadership. So really appreciate everything you all are doing. Take care.
Thank you. So I will say that we've had obviously many, many more questions come in than we could possibly answer on today's call, despite how generous Jean and Noel both were with their time. We are tracking all of these questions, and I'll say that also especially to the people who put in questions in the Q&A box and then noticed that it was dismissed. We're not dismissing your question. It just means that we weren't able to get to it today. But we are creating and will continue to update FAQs that we'll be posting on our website, that we'll be sharing out with our full network. And we'll work to get all of your questions answered as soon as we possibly can. We are also, several people have asked about listening to the recording of Monday's national call and Jean's remarks on that. We'll share the link for that. We'll also share the link for this webinar both now, and we'll share it in follow-up, a follow-up email that we'll send to everybody who participates on this webinar and to our full network of people who participate in our national calls as well. So we do have two more speakers that are going to share additional important information around the principles for model programs, how we at NLIHC are tracking progress related to this guidance at the local level, and some new resources that we're publishing today, and a little bit more on centering racial equity that Clarence talked about at the start. So I want to move to the next slide, please, and just to very briefly mention, sorry, go back a couple slides there. Go back one more. Yeah, right here. Thank you. So as a reminder, a couple of weeks ago, the National Income Housing Coalition, together with the National League of Cities and Mayors and CEOs for U.S. housing investment, put out a document to share principles for model ERA programs. And you've heard a lot about these principles today, both from our elected officials at the start of the call who have already and very early embedded them into their programs, and from the White House and the U.S. Department of Treasury about how important these principles are to the Biden and Harris administration. So we will share in the chat box and in the, as follow-up materials, the document for these principles. Next slide, please. We also have in that document the do's and don'ts for local and state elected officials who are running their own ERA programs to follow. And I would say again that following these principles from the document from NLIHC and NLC is not only the right thing to do in order to serve the lowest income and most marginalized tenants in your community, but is also clearly very well aligned with the Department of Treasury's and White House's new guidance. So I would say if you're following this quick tips, do's and don'ts, you are also very likely aligning yourself with the requirements, the new requirements from the Department of Treasury and the White House. So I strongly encourage you to. So next slide, please. So I'm going to turn now to first to my colleague at the National Income Housing Coalition, Rebecca Yeh. She's a senior research analyst on our emergency rental assistance team, and she's going to talk a little bit more about how we are tracking emergency rental assistance programs and some new tools, both available now and coming soon, that can help with this work. So Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane. Next slide, please. So, as a number of people have already discussed earlier today, there are a lot of really key important issues that are in play right now in the emergency rental assistance programs, and we are tracking them, including use of self-attestation, direct-to-tenant assistance, serving tenants with federal rent subsidies. And next slide, please. I wanted to draw your attention to something new that we are doing, which is a dashboard. You can check it out at this link here, nlhc.org/ERA-dashboard. This interactive dashboard is going to be sharing information on the status of emergency rental assistance programs and key design and implementation features that enable these programs to really best serve and efficiently serve the lowest income and most marginalized renters. On the dashboard, you can see how many programs are actively being implemented, how many are closed, as well as follow up on key issues of concern. So as I mentioned before, self-attestation, direct-to-tenant assistance, serving tenants with federal rent subsidies. We'll be adding some more indicators of interest as time goes on, such as programs offering relocation assistance. I know that we're running a little bit short on time, so I'll go on to the next slide. The dashboard will share on these key aspects, and you'll be able to filter through programs to see other programs that are, say, doing self-attestation, or if any programs in similar jurisdictions are offering direct-to-tenant assistance. So we're really hoping that this tool will help you all monitor, track, and advocate as well. Next slide, please. I also wanted to plug our emergency rental assistance database. The National Income Housing Coalition has been tracking emergency rental assistance programs created or expanded in response to COVID-19 for the past year. And we are switching gears on this main emergency rental assistance database to show only the programs that are part of the federal Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So you'll be able to search for programs in your locality or state and get information on them using that search bar. The last thing I will mention is that some of the most frequently asked questions that we get around how programs can model after these key principles for emergency rental assistance programs is, how are other programs doing that? What kinds of forms are they using to carry that out? So we are also putting together resources to share how programs are, for example, implementing self-attestation, or how they're showing their real-time program data, et cetera. So that's kind of, I'll leave it there. Please check out those different web pages. And as always, we are continuing to monitor and track emergency rental assistance programs and updating that database 3 times a week.
Great, thanks so much, Rebecca. And just to underscore, and I really encourage everybody to utilize these resources. The database now is very user-friendly for renters or their allies to search for open, available emergency rental assistance programs. And the dashboard is going to be really useful to local and state and national advocacy to track which programs are following the guidelines and the guidance, and which aren't, and working to help those who aren't to course correct and improve programs so that they do reach the lowest income and most marginalized tenants. And just to say too that there may be information missing. We may not be getting it all right. That's the reason why we want to be so transparent with the data that we're tracking, so that you can help us get it right. So if you see things that are missing, if you know of programs that are doing it differently, please reach out to any of us at NLIHC, and we will update and continuously, as Rebecca said, update this database and these tools. So I'm going to turn now to our final speaker, which is Lauren Lowry from National League of Cities, to talk more about, as we did at the start of the call and heard from her boss, Clarence Anthony, about the importance of centering and embedding racial equity in this work. So Lauren, thanks so much for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane. And just to emphasize why it's important to embed racial equity and operationalize is because we want to reach those with the greatest needs. And when we're not centering racial equity, we are missing out on target populations, not only Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but also a population such as people with disabilities or limited English. And so it's very important for us to get this right, and that we're not just blanket the rental assistance, but we're actually helping those in need, and that in our design and implementation, we're getting it right, but also why it's important that we hold ourselves accountable by implementing racial equity performance metrics, and making sure that with those performance metrics that we are hitting the target. And if we're not hitting the target, that we can easily pivot and make sure that we are helping those greatest in need. And with racial equity, that also means working with community stakeholders like trusted community-based organization to go into communities, but also taking in other equity implications as to why certain subpopulations are not getting the needed dollars. So, and making it simple for renters to receive funding. So really taking into consideration the principles that are laid out with partnering with community-based partners, also making applications simple, having the ability for renters to verify getting direct assistance to renters, but most importantly, building engagement with landlords so that assistance gets to renters. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Diane.
Great, thank you so much, Lauren. So I want to again thank all of you who participated in this webinar, to remind you that we will make the webinar, the recorded webinar, available to you, along with the call that we had on Monday with Jean Sperling and Erica Pothig and others, where we also talked about the emergency rental assistance programs. We'll continue to share with you the resources that we have made available and new resources that will be coming in the coming days and weeks. I want to sincerely thank our partners, the National League of Cities and Mayors and CEOs for U.S. Housing Investment, for working with us on these model principles for ERA program. I want to thank you for your leadership in sharing these principles with your members throughout the country. To thank, of course, Jean Sperling and Noel Poyo for their good, hard work on getting this right, helping us all get this right. And many thanks to Mayor Schaff and Councilwoman Veragran and the National League of Cities President and CEO Clarence Anthony for joining us on this call. So thank you very much. Please plan to join next week's national call from the National Low Income Housing Coalition every Monday afternoon, where we'll continue to talk about emergency rental assistance and how to get it right. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.